Welcome again, everybody. I'm Smita, part of Team Thunai. Vanakkam and Namaskar to everyone here. A little about Thunai is that Thunai is an organization that aims to work towards building trauma awareness, recovery, and resilience. We are working towards providing open resources on trauma recovery and neuroscience proven evidence based self care practices in Tamil and in English. Today's webinar is the second of our trauma awareness series, and the topic for today is trauma. The facilitator for this evening is Dr.Mahima Muralidharan. Before we begin, a few things about how we're going to go about this next 1 hour. This is a safe and inclusive space. You're free to share your reflections and questions. However, we request you to mute your mics so that we can hear each other very clearly. If you wish to participate or ask questions, please use the raise your hand option or type in your message as a chat, and the facilitator will reach out to you. The facilitation part of the webinar will be recorded, and we will stop recording once Mahima indicates that the session is open for sharing, which is when you can unmute yourself and have Q&A or share. Anyone who wishes to receive the recording can email us at connect@thunai.org. I welcome Dr. Mahima Muralidharan today. She's right here. Just give me 1 second till I put her on spotlight. So she was on spotlight. All right. Mahima is a native of Chennai, and she is a trauma specialist based and practicing in San Francisco. She has extensive experience in providing psychological care for adults, children, and families, and designing mental health programs. She advises companies on trauma-informed practices and workplace well-being. Mahima serves as the Chief Psychology Officer at Vicarious, a San Francisco-based digital therapeutic company. Mahima teaches and is passionate about concepts like social justice and equity-based initiatives. She has been advising Thunai on its many, many projects and has been a solid support. I personally find many discussions very enriching. Mahima, without any further delay, over to you. Just give me a minute to stop sharing.
All right. Well, thank you, Smita, for that introduction, and good evening and whatever time zone you're in. Greetings of the day. It's definitely early for me in San Francisco, so I'm trying to caffeinate myself as much as possible. So if you find the second half of my presentation, I'm getting faster in my talking, it's because the caffeine is probably kicking in. Before I actually pull my slides up, a couple of things I want to say. The reason this topic is so important is that it's often neglected, right? That there are many of us who are in a caregiving capacity, either working in a hospital setting, providing medical care, at home, maybe supporting people in our life, our loved ones who need some extra attention when it comes to their emotional health, or just out in the world. Sometimes you're just walking on the street and you see something traumatic happen to someone, and it immediately transports you to wanting to help in some way. And we don't always have the tools to do this, right? We come from a good place, good intentions, but in the moment, it can be a really hard thing to do. And what we don't realize is the more we expose ourselves to trauma and things that are happening to others around us, we're actually taking in a lot of that energy ourselves. And it, over time, actually compromises our capacity to fully be available and do the work in the way that we really want to do that. So this topic is very dear to my heart, partly also because I spent 13 years in community mental health settings and did a lot of trauma work. did not understand or realize that I was impacted psychologically by that work. And when I realized it, it felt really, really important to raise awareness, not just for myself, but also the colleagues that I work with, for us to be thinking about, hey, what is this phenomenon? What am I feeling? How can I sustain being in a caregiving role? And if we don't understand vicarious trauma and self-care, that's going to be much harder to do. So let's get started in that spirit. I'm going to share some slides and be talking at you for a few minutes, and then we'll shift to our Q&A. Give me 1 second to pull up my slides. While I'm pulling up my slides in the chat function, I would love for you to just put in one word about how you're feeling today. I know a lot of you have probably had a long week already. It's Friday evening, which is a commitment to be here. So thank you for that. And also just take a minute, take a few seconds to fully bring your intention into this space. I know transitioning between things that we're doing on Zoom can be really hard. So take a few deep breaths, take a minute, ground yourself. If your feet are not on the ground, firmly plant them. Take some deep breaths. And one reminder, sometimes when we go to trauma-focused trainings, it can be a little hard to stay with the content, especially if you're actively dealing with something right now. So I encourage you to go off camera if you need to, leave the Zoom room if you need to, and come back in. We're very flexible. You can join at any time. Just pace yourself and sort of be paying attention to that. So we have some folks saying that they're interested in learning more, which is a great way to come into this space and being open. And with that, I'm actually going to start sharing my slides. Can everybody see my slides? Yes? Okay, cool.
Yes.
We've kind of covered this, right? The importance of self-care, why we're here today. So let's start with, what is trauma? You hear this word being thrown out a lot. In fact, sometimes I feel like it's misused as a buzzword. So when we're talking about trauma, we're actually not talking about just experiences that are difficult for us. So for example, maybe you plan your week in a certain way and it's not going as planned. Every single day, there's something really disappointing. That does not equate trauma, right? Those are difficult experiences that we, by and large, have some emotional capacity to cope with. But when we're talking about trauma, we're actually talking about distinct events, or it could be a series of events, or a set of circumstances in someone's life, right? That is either physically or emotionally harmful to them, or actually in some cases even life-threatening. And the key is that it actually has lasting emotional effects over the course of our lifetime. So when we're talking about something traumatic, we're actually talking about something for which we don't have usually the emotional capacity or the resources to cope with. This is really important because when we talk about trauma and we think about something as traumatic, you often find that it is, for folks who experience it, it's actually an experience where they don't actually know what is going on. They don't know what to do. It feels like it is too much to bear. And so when we feel overwhelmed, what we naturally do is actually seek support, right? So if you are the person in a medical setting or in a psychology-based clinic or at home providing care for a loved one, then you have to be available in a way to help that person kind of understand their experience, digest their experience, actually process that experience emotionally. So you're holding that capacity and function on behalf of someone who's experiencing trauma. So what are some types of trauma? I've simplified this for our purpose today. We could spend a whole hour just talking about the types of trauma, but let's think about the types of primary trauma. Acute trauma, this refers to events that are one time, right? So a good example of this is someone is in a really bad car accident. It is very traumatic. They thought they were almost going to die, but they didn't. That experience is going to shape how they get in a car the next time, maybe avoiding driving, maybe avoiding going places. That would be an example of an acute trauma. And when we're talking about chronic trauma, now we're talking about experiences that are prolonged and over time. So good examples of this is probably domestic violence over time, poverty, child neglect, physical abuse. These are all things that are happening over time. Sexual abuse often happens over time, right? So those are chronic traumas. And then we have some that are collective and group-based, right? So in this category, we're talking about caste-based trauma. Belonging to a certain caste can be actually very traumatic, right? So if you're being discriminated against or marginalized, caste-based trauma is a real thing. Identity-based trauma. So when you identify as queer or LGBTQ or have a distinct identity in your life that is a marginalized identity, sometimes religion could be that too. These are traumatic experiences that generations experience as a group. And then lastly, historical or intergenerational trauma. Actually, a good example of this is probably our colonial legacy in India, right? That we've been under British rule for years and years and years. Actually, not just the British, a lot of colonizing. And that is actually a historically and intergenerationally traumatic event. We're still kind of understanding the impact of it and coming out of it, but that's a good example of a historical or intergenerational trauma. By the way, if you have questions come up, just feel free to put them in chat and we'll hold them for you and answer them later. So one thing to remember about trauma is when we talk about trauma, our body keeps the score. And this is actually from Bessel van der Kolk, who has done a lot of research on trauma. And I love the way he phrased this, because what we also forget is a lot of times we forget that we actually have a body, right? That today we're all in a space together. Lots of cameras are off. We can't even actually see each other. And so then when that happens, even more chance that we're not locating ourselves in our body. I know Smita and Girish know this really well. I keep repeating this to them. I forget sometimes to, like, when I sit down on a Zoom call, to actually put my feet on the ground. And the more I do it, I realize that I can fully be in my body and actually own that I have a body. So when you're talking about trauma, a lot of the effects of trauma are actually stored in the body. So just treating the mind alone is not going to be as helpful as having a more holistic approach, right? So we want to bring in a mind-body connection to how we understand trauma and how we treat trauma. And this is culturally, for India, actually is not a new concept at all, right? Take the practice of yoga, for example, right? There's a huge mind-body component already integrated into that practice, which is actually why it is so therapeutic. So not new information, just a quick reminder for folks that this is the gold standard when it comes to actually treating trauma, is bringing your mind and your body into the mix. Let's see. Okay, so when we experience trauma, what are we seeing? So in the first few moments after something traumatic has happened, you tend to see folks who experience a lot of shock, right? Disbelief. I can't believe this happened. The reality actually does not set in for a very long time. You could see numbness, which is kind of a flat affect. You can't actually read what somebody's feeling in the moment. A lot of head shaking. There isn't a way that the mind can actually process what has happened. And in general, like the way people experience this and describe it is, I woke up at 7 this morning. I don't know what happened the whole day. I just feel numb. I'm not able to respond to anyone, right? So that's actually a symptom of trauma. Disorientation, this is pretty extreme, but sometimes you find that people are really confused about what has happened. Loss of touch with reality, just temporarily. Difficulty focusing. This is a hard one to understand because we're all always experiencing that to some extent because we're so overstimulated all the time. But when it comes to trauma, it's actually really hard. You can see that there's a restlessness. It's really hard to focus on things and get jobs done. Classic example of the focusing issue is, let's say somebody's lost a loved one really suddenly. Probably, with COVID, this has been our reality, right? you need a lot of attention to actually get through all the tasks that's needed to complete something after someone dies. Very hard thing for a lot of people to do when that death in their life has been traumatic. So it's an example of that. And then lastly, dissociation. I kind of spoke to this. I think numbness and dissociation kind of go hand in hand, but it is the feeling of feeling unreal. Like you don't feel like you're in your body. You feel like you're actually observing something that's happening to you, and not quite emotionally all put together. So these are in the earliest moments after something traumatic happens. And then at an individual level, what happens over time, sleep is the first thing that's impacted, right? Like a lot of times people with trauma backgrounds will say, I can't sleep at all. Staying up, restlessness, actually fear of falling asleep. Rapid changes in mood. Could be fine 1 minute and then you realize, oh, okay, what happened? You were okay 2 minutes ago, you're not feeling the same way now, either a lot of depression or a lot of mania. High levels of anxiety, goes without saying. Trouble staying in the moment. So this is a hard one because when you've had something traumatic happen, it makes sense that we're having a hard time staying in the present. But what I mean by this is there's a way that you can't actually be in any moment. So things start to feel very fragmented in your mind. Like you can't put together a coherent timeline of what's happening because you're not fully present. That's a little different from just feeling overwhelmed. Hypervigilance, which is when we are hyper attuned to everything. So good example of this particularly with COVID, I've been talking with a lot of folks. Every time the phone rings, they say their heart skips a beat. They're worried it's going to be someone calling to say something bad has happened, or someone has tested positive, or that it's sort of like small signals are always a reminder of something that is terrible and awful that's about to happen, or so we're scanning our environment for that. That's hypervigilance. And then lastly, somatic symptoms, the classic, backaches, headaches, not able to move, a lot of body pain. When you have intense trauma, you're actually looking at a lot of body pain. So why is this important? Let me on Zoom, and my slides take a little bit of a lag. So at the group level, what trauma looks like is it actually triggers our previous traumas. So something new happens. This is not a great example, but I was actually thinking a lot about for those of you who remember the tsunami warnings in Chennai, right? This was many, many years ago. There was a sort of that was a collective trauma, right? It was, you're waiting, you didn't know, you knew you couldn't control it. It's beyond human force to actually control something like that. But it brought up a lot of anxiety. COVID is sort of similar, right? So now we're in another experience of pandemic as a trauma, and it kind of triggers those memories, maybe not consciously, and then you could go back in history and see there have been several historical events that have been traumas that actually triggers other trauma reactions for us. When things are happening at a group level, we actually have a lot of trouble understanding what is it that I am feeling versus what am I feeling on behalf of the group, right? So we're social animals. So from a sociology standpoint, this is how we operate. This is actually how we know how to be in a group. And then lastly, it actually changes the values of a group. So in a good way, actually, you see communities coming together, right? Like when there's been a disaster, you always hear about how others are showing up in a community. That's an expression of our values, that we are saying something about, hey, I care enough to do this. And it does actually change communities. It changes values over time. Okay, so let's move on to actually why we're talking about vicarious trauma today. I wanted to give you an introduction, understanding common language around what trauma is, how do we experience it. Whether we like it or not, all over the world, we're also in a mental health pandemic right now. This was always true. I don't think this is a new phenomenon by any means, but COVID kind of has made us all hit the reset button, which means even the folks who believed they did not have any emotional health related issues or needed to focus on their emotional health, let alone trauma, are now realizing that, okay, this is not actually working for us. And what can we do to strengthen our mind? What can we do to like really understand what is going on for us emotionally, right? So we've kind of shared a common experience across the globe that has highlighted why we need more and more mental health resources, why we need spaces like this to come together and talk about mental health, right? So it's not a stigma, it is not a sign of weakness. And when you're talking about trauma, I would argue that trauma is also a pandemic that we've never taken seriously. In certain cultures, trauma, there's a lot of transparency about trauma. In other cultures, there isn't transparency about trauma. But the more we talk about it, the more we educate ourselves, the more self-aware we become, the greater the chance that we're actually going to help the people who need help and help ourselves in the process. So what is vicarious trauma? I've talked a lot about what is trauma. Now, when we come to vicarious trauma, for those of us who are caregivers, professionals working in the space of providing mental health care, and like I said, even medical health care, right? Any kind of health care. There's actually a cumulative, meaning over time, and something transformative, right? So it transforms us as people. And that is, there's a psychological effect of providing care, of being there for others, for helping, that kind of changes us emotionally over time. And we don't recognize this. It's not obvious. You don't wake up one day feeling like, oh, I'm traumatized from this. You just keep giving. This is the thing about, those of us who are drawn to like caregiving professions. You hear stories. I always ask people like, what brought you to this field? And every time I ask that question, people say, I don't know. Even when I was a child, people would always come to me and talk to me. I have this experience of riding on public transport here, and I'll be sitting with somebody, random stranger will start talking to me about their childhood trauma stories, right? I'm not saying anything to them. So some of us, I think when you kind of have that energy in your life of a caregiver, you're going to draw a lot of these stories, which means you provide a very important function in your community, in your professional life, in your family, but that also takes a toll because you're holding a lot of that trauma yourself. That impact is what we refer to as vicarious trauma. By the way, trauma actually has been studied way more than vicarious trauma has. And so we're starting to get more and more research in this space, which is good, because I think something in parallel needs to happen, right? So we're better equipped to actually provide the care we need to provide. So what are symptoms of vicarious trauma? Not surprisingly, this looks exactly like the list that I shared with you about trauma, right? Sleep disturbances, restlessness, intrusive thoughts, avoidance. Some days you may wake up feeling like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't even want to go in to work today. Hypervigilance. Every patient, every person who walks in the door that you're about to help, you're kind of wondering, oh, is this going to be another horrific trauma story? Am I ready for this? Can I take this on? Body symptoms. I already talked about this one. Guilt and self-blame. This is a big one. This is when we start feeling more and more like, I could have done more to help that person. If only I had said the right things, maybe they would have felt a little better, or I couldn't really ease their pain. And then we have our own case of dissociation, which is just sort of not fully being there, fully present, and our mind isn't quite available to take in any of the cognitive stimuli that's coming in. So let's talk about compassion fatigue and burnout. This is actually my favorite slide for many reasons. The biggest reason being, I think burnout is the most misunderstood phenomenon I've kind of experienced in my life. And I know that's probably a provocative statement, but I will say that we use the word burnout really loosely, right? Everybody's burnt out, everything is burning me out. That's actually not the case. So when we're talking about compassion fatigue, we're actually looking at all of these three things being present. So exhaustion, inefficacy, and cynicism. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about these. So what do we mean by exhaustion? We have this, it's a Friday night and you're here. You're probably feeling a bit fatigued and depleted, right? Like you've already had a long week. And you feel it. Your energy is different. You could use some rest. Hopefully, if you're not working on Saturday, that's great, but a lot of us will be. And just thinking about it gives you, I sometimes find that on a Sunday night is the most fatigued that I feel. It's not related exactly to vicarious trauma. It's how overworked we are, the rhythms we've created, the lack of self-care practices. Then you move into inefficacy, right? This is the zone where you're exhausted and you're feeling like, okay, I'm not making any progress here. Sometimes I have these days where I'm sort of like, what is coming out of my mouth right now? None of this is making sense. I don't feel like I'm particularly being insightful or helpful to the person sitting across from me. Feeling really like, okay, I need to shift out of this. I actually need to connect with my mind again to be useful to you, right? Very different from cynicism, which is when we get resentful, we lose sight of our values. We're not feeling like, okay, this is the work I want to do at all. Everybody irritates you. You are a caregiver and you just want them to stop sharing with you, right? Cynicism is very different from inefficacy. But for burnout to be a reality, we actually need all of these three components. So when we're talking just about exhaustion, that's not burnout. When we talk just about, hey, I'm not able to operate to my 100% today, that's not burnout. But when you add the cynicism component, that is a sign of also vicarious trauma and burnout. So let's keep that in mind. And I know this slide always brings up a lot of feelings for a lot of people, so we can definitely debate it, talk about it in the Q&A portion. Now, I want to make another distinction between why burnout is so important for us to understand and think about and differentiate from other things, right? So we all have stress in our life. It's just a given, right? I haven't met anyone who is stress-free. But there's an important component that kind of changes stress into burnout, and that is rumination. So let's say you've had a really bad day or a really hard experience, or you sat with somebody and listened to their story and that was really hard to take in. A lot of times it puts us into reflection mode. So you may be reflecting on, oh, that was hard, but I got through it. These are the things I said to that person that really helped. Maybe I could have said this better, or I could have held their experience better. That is all still reflection, because you're reviewing something that happened, but you're actually planning ahead, and it's not debilitating you in any way, right? So you can still move forward. But when we're looking at rumination, these are things that we do. Whenever you say the word rumination, you kind of have this hand motion, right? That these are the thoughts that are repeatedly negative thoughts that are just simmering in your mind. You regret the past, and the future actually does not look like progress. It doesn't look like a learning experience. It just stays as anxiety. So the reason I'm pointing this out is when you're looking at burnout, we're actually looking a lot at rumination. But when you're looking at stress, a lot of times it's still in the reflection zone, right? So if you catch yourself ruminating, being aware that there may be strategies to snap out of that and catch yourself in it is actually really, really important. So now let's talk just for a couple of minutes about resilience. This is also a term you probably heard a lot, comes up quite a bit. And what we mean by resilience is actually the capacity that each one of us has to bounce back from something that was a really hard experience, something traumatic, or any sort of adversity, right? So as much as resilience involves bouncing back, it actually also profoundly impacts us because of personal growth. So when we're looking at resilient skills, we're actually looking at growing personally from the life experiences that we've had that have been particularly difficult. Now, this is actually one of my favorite slides, because I think there's kind of a misunderstanding or a misperception that resilience is just something that some people have. They're just a resilient person and I'm not. And that is actually not the case. And research shows this over and over again. So what does resilience actually involve? It involves behaviors. So habits, practices, skills, behaviors, thoughts, and actions that anyone can actually learn and cultivate. It is not the select few that are, born with resilient traits. It's actually all of us, all of humanity. It is not personality or ability driven, right? Just because I'm a certain kind of extrovert, I'm not more resilient than somebody else. And the ability to learn resilience. So key word is we actually learn resilience. It's not innate. Is one reason actually that research has shown that resilience is actually in fact very ordinary and nothing extraordinary. Really important to keep in mind, especially when we're working with trauma survivors. This is important for people to realize, right? That it's not just that one person is going to be able to bounce back from trauma differently. That is true because of the resources available to them, but innately, we have this capacity to all be resilient. So I've talked a lot about resilience. How do you cultivate it, right? So we're looking at actually having some coping strategies across 3 of these domains. So the 3 domains are cognitive, body-based, somatic, and the relational. I like to highlight this because we're actually all really, really good at one of these 3 categories. For a really long time, before I understood that the body was as important as the mind, my go-to was always the cognitive strategies, right? I wanted to read more about something and I found that was really helpful, or really I can tune in, understand my feelings, name them, right? Still all in the cognitive realm. But when you look at the body-based or the somatic, we're actually looking at strategies that can kind of kickstart our parasympathetic nervous system, right? So good example of this is when you're feeling really restless or anxious, if you take an ice pack and put it on your chest, you can't actually feel anxious and be cold at the same time. Another example of this is actually running really fast. Even if you're standing in place and running really fast and getting your cardio up, it's really hard to be anxious and bring your cardio up at the same time. So there are some good tricks in terms of how you kind of recharge the body or stop a cycle of anxiety. So that's all body-based. And then lastly, relational, right? We sometimes forget and take for granted that we can actually connect with people. Who are these people in our life that we can easily call? So one thing I do periodically is, in my phone, you can have on your, like your phone address book, you can have favorites. And I always look at who are the people on my most called list or my favorites, who haven't I reached out to in a really long time. And sometimes I find that reaching out to somebody who I'm actually very close to, maybe haven't talked to in a long time, can give me a lot more energy quite immediately. So the 3 domains, cognitive, body, and relational, the reason it's up here is I want us to be thinking, as you're taking in this information today, think about what strategies do you have in each of these categories that you can do more of? And maybe you do a lot of cognitive strategies, you don't do the body and relational. What can you add to your repertoire of what you do? So just some information to keep in mind. And then I want to talk actually a little bit about emotion regulation, which unfortunately, like burnout, is also a misunderstood concept sometimes. And not a lot of us are familiar maybe with this particular terminology, but when you are talking about vicarious trauma and when you're talking about helping others and just in general in our own lives, emotion regulation is such a key component of how we are in the world, right? Nobody teaches you this. It kind of comes naturally to us as humans, but it actually refers to the ability that we each have to identify emotions. What am I feeling in the moment? And modulate those emotions, right? So for example, if I'm feeling really angry and I have to walk into a meeting and the people I'm going to meet with are not the reason I'm angry, I have to do something about how angry I'm feeling, right? You have to kind of, either I hold it in, or I have a squeeze ball. I have to do something to modulate that before I can go meet with this group of people. But if I'm going to meet with the people who made me angry, my modulation is going to look very different, right? Like maybe I'll be snappy, maybe I could say something. That process of modulating our emotions, we're doing that unconsciously all the time. It's just happening. It's in the background. But when we bring attention to it, you actually have a chance to impact it and do it in a way that's not leading to burnout and not leading to more traumatization for yourself even sometimes. So what are these skills? Let's take a quick look at that. The first one is self-awareness, right? We can't be self-aware unless we actually slow down our thinking and make some space to really recognize what we're feeling. So let's just try to do that now, right? You're in here, you're listening to me. You haven't probably been paying too much attention to yourself because there are slides, you're reading, you're listening to my voice. But bring your attention back to yourself right now. And what do you notice? What are you feeling? Are you feeling puzzled? Are you feeling bored? Are you feeling, oh, this is exciting to be here and to learn this? I can say for myself, I was a little bit anxious getting started, right? Like it's a webinar, there are people watching you. And as I've been presenting, that feeling has gone away. Right now I'm feeling kind of recharged. I'm feeling a bit excited. So just pay attention to that. And if you want to share that in chat, I'd love to just hear what came up for you. What's your level of self-awareness? What are you feeling? In interest of time, I'm going to move us along, but if you want to take a minute to think about that, please do. Mindfulness, right? This is a little bit different from just being self-aware. It is actually bringing intentionality to that mind-body connection that I was just talking about. And this is not just through meditation. I meet a lot of people who say, I really want to learn how to meditate. I can't do it past like the first 30 seconds. My mind is always wandering. That's not the point of this. I think mindfulness is actually cultivating a habit around being fully present in whatever, right? If you're restless, be fully present in that, and that's okay, and don't judge that, which goes back to the self-compassion, which is also on this list, right? We've been socialized to really judge ourselves really quickly. How do we break out of that cycle? Cognitive reappraisal. This one is a really key strategy, right? This is really how flexible we are cognitively. I planned my day, it's not going as planned. What am I going to do? Just give up? Or do I reset my expectations? And the resetting of expectations is actually what I mean by cognitive reappraisal. So you take, like for example, I was in a facilitation last week, and for whatever reason, Zoom did not let me share my slides. There was some blocker on the other end. Okay, this was an 1.5-hour presentation. Now I can't share my slides. Honestly, what I wanted to do was like put my head down and cry, because like, what are you going to do for 90 minutes? But that's not going to help me, right? There's some cognitive process needed to quickly be creative, to snap out of it, to be flexible. It took me 20 minutes to figure that out, but getting there felt really good. And it was actually ended up being a much better presentation because you can actually see each other and talk to each other rather than the slides. And I actually enjoyed it. Cognitive reappraisal and adaptability go hand in hand. So this is something to keep in mind, right? Like flexibility, teaching others flexibility. So when you're talking with a trauma survivor, one thing that's very helpful is to actually be thinking about, hey, what else could I do right now? I know this has already happened, right? I'm here to listen to that, but this is an opportunity for a different kind of relationship with someone. And I'm here. How can I teach you to be more adaptable? And how can I be more adaptable as a caregiver? Because without this, vicarious trauma is going to be the reality. I can tell you that the work that I did with community mental health and working with kids, I had to change my expectations of what parents could do. I would go in with, you have to do XYZ as a parent to help your child, and freely give advice even when I didn't have a child at that point. And didn't help, actually. I think it didn't really help further the work. But once I realized that, okay, maybe how I'm approaching this isn't maybe the only way to do it. What are the other perspectives? Holding different perspectives at the same time, right? That's what we mean by adaptability. And then self-compassion, I briefly touched on this. This is our kind of default mode of judging ourselves and not being kind to ourselves, and fully recognizing that, hey, maybe I can't see another person today who has a trauma story, right? That's a limit. And sometimes when we don't have the self-awareness to set that limit, then you start judging yourself. Then that leads to resentment and the cynicism and the burnout cycle that I mentioned, right? It's not just the work, it's actually also personally that we're not feeling grounded in our own limits, setting boundaries. We're gonna get through this one slide and then move on to some Q&A. I just wanted us to also think about a few things to keep in mind as a care provider. How can you minimize your own vicarious trauma is by getting better at how we offer support. So here are some do's and don'ts, right? The first one is actually setting clear boundaries and prioritize your self-care. So if you need to take a break, do it, right? It's not something you postpone. We all feel it, and then sometimes we don't act on it. How many trauma folks you see in a day, if you're a mental health care provider, that's really important. Think about who you're scheduling. How are you scheduling? If you're in a healthcare setting, this is also really important. But a lot of hospitals have, you have to meet your hours. You can't just, you're probably at somebody else's mercy in terms of setting those limits for yourself. But what can you do? Really quick hacks. Maybe you need to schedule 10 minutes before you see somebody else. Ask for that or try to do that. Cut out things that are not working, right? In the don't list, I didn't add this, but there's things we do that are not helpful. Caffeine for me is one thing like that, right? I realized that just relying on coffee to get through trauma stories, that's not a really sustainable. Let's see somebody's hand up. Girish?
Yeah, I think there was one question in the chat,
yes,
which was about boundaries. If you could look that up. If you are especially as a professional caregiver, it's easier to some extent, your mind works around probabilities and right, then you kind of get attuned to setting some limit.
Right.
But if you're a family caregiver, you realize that your life and your outcome is so critical, right? So how do you set limits as a family caregiver? It's a question from someone. Yeah.
That's a great question, and my answer actually doesn't differ that much, because I think even in a family caregiving situation, I feel like no, and I mean this right, in a way, this is a cultural phenomenon for us, right? But because I think in a lot of Indian cultures, and I'm using that in plural because we're not, it's not a homogeneous culture by any means. There's lots of differences. But when it comes to family, I think there is a culture around, I need to put everyone else first, right? Because we're a collectivist culture. It's the beauty of who we are. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that each individual in that family system has their own emotional needs, including you as a caregiver, right? We don't express it, we don't talk about it, but it's true. We all feel it. And so what I find more and more is, even in family systems like that, empowering yourself to know what that limit is. And just because somebody has experienced a trauma in their life, in your family, and you're the caregiver, it does not mean that there needs to be a boundarylessness all the time. But in fact, that is actually more hurtful to the person who has experienced the trauma, right? Because a lot of times what we're looking for is some kind of sturdiness to bump up against, something that's a real limit, but that's loving and kind. And to even say, hey, I'm at my maximum today. I'm going to be here no matter what. I'm going to always be here for you. But I need a little bit of a break. And it's not a break from you. It's actually a break for me to build my own capacity up, be there more fully for you, right? However, whatever language we want to use. But I think the boundary kind of looks the same, because just endlessly taking in trauma is not going to help you. The best way I can describe this is put on your own oxygen mask first before you help the person next to you put theirs on. Because if you don't do that, you can't help them. And it's in both of your best interests to actually have you take that time, whatever that time looks like.
Thank you. That's helpful. So not only the boundary itself, but how you communicate it is so crucial, right?
Exactly. I mean, if you just throw your hands up and walk away, that is a very different communication than explain to someone why. Let's take a break. You know, we're fighting about this right now. Let's take a break. We both need to take deep breaths. We can come back. When we come back, we have a chance of actually seeing something different. That is very different from just abandoning. And most people are more willing to engage with you if you're transparent, if you give them some choice. All trauma-informed principles. We didn't talk about that today, but it's how can you be trauma-informed even in the way you take the break? That's the point.
Right.
Thank you. All right. I'm actually not going to spend more time on these. These have been up for a while. Let's move to Q&A. I know we don't have too much more time, so.
So Mahima, we've been having a lot of questions right from the onset. So I'm just going to read them out to you. Probably you can see them in the chat yourself. The first one was here about, can you grade trauma like a particular type of trauma is far less compared to some of the often spoken ones? That's the question by Renuka Setunathan.
Can we actually read that, Smita? I'm not able to see it on my chat screen here, but...
Sure. Can you grade trauma like a particular type of trauma is far less compared to some other often spoken ones?
That is a difficult thing to do, because if it feels traumatic to that person who experienced it, that defines the intensity of it, right? So, for example, if I said, hey, all that happened to you is you lost your parent, but this person here had sexual abuse their whole life, and that's more of a trauma. That doesn't ring true, right? So you can't actually grade trauma, because for the person who lost their parent, that shapes their entire life. They can't imagine moving forward without that parent in their life. Maybe that was the only protective person in their life. So I think the point is that it's not grading the different kinds of trauma. I think a lot of times individuals have that choice in defining what feels traumatic to them. But the distinction I want to make is not everything we experience in life is trauma, right? This is why I made the example about some things are just difficult experiences versus with teenagers, you see this a lot. A friend may stop talking to them, and that's experienced as a trauma. I would argue it's probably not trauma, it's relational difficulty, but it can feel traumatic if that is the only friend you have, right? That's very different. Now suddenly the intensity of that feels different to you. That tips it into trauma. But if you have 15 people in your social circle, one person stops talking to you, different.
My question is about the trauma which is happening due to the pandemic. How do we check on the real trauma that people are going through? Is there a workshop for doing this?
Absolutely. I did not address this in this section of the seminar, but one thing I wanted to say, Ravi, is actually it is happening, because I've run a few workshops for a few companies based out of India Good examples are Salesforce and Airbnb. They are actually offering COVID trauma-focused support groups, and I've done some presentations for both those companies. So there is something happening in that space. And I will tell you my own experience of leading those workshops, the floodgates do open, right? So to your point, people are hesitant. This is a misperception about Indian culture. I think a lot of times people think that because we do express a lot of emotion, but we don't express difficult emotions, that there is a norm around that, doesn't mean we're not experiencing difficult emotions, right? How we deal with it, how we express it looks different. But what I find is when I've offered space for people to actually come together and talk about it, they hear each other's stories. For a while, people are quiet in the audience, and then the floodgates actually open, and you have the opposite problem of, this is a workspace. How are you going to contain this in a way that is actually helpful and not just re-traumatizing to share stories without any, limits? But it can be done. And I to your point, I actually feel like it's maybe going to take a couple of tries or more. But the more you start offering a space and saying, hey, this is what I want you to do, and this is important as an employee because I care about your well-being, people do take that up. Happy to connect with you. I think Smita or Girish can probably give you my email too if you want to talk more about this. I'm happy to spend some time.
Thank you, Mahima.
Of course.
Absolutely, yes. So Mahima, we have another question. You probably addressed this, but I'm still going to ask this to you. While both caregivers and professionals might experience vicarious trauma differently, don't they feel it differently? And the person also shares that somehow I have a feeling that caregivers often don't have an out.
Great distinction to make, because the emotional attachment is different, right? When you talk about a patient walking into your office and then leaving and going back to their own home and you're not living with them, emotionally, the way you're impacted is going to look different. With the family member and caregiver dynamic, a lot of times what I find is the family member who is the caregiver also feels implicated in the trauma, right? Either I didn't stand up and protect you and this happened to you, or I was a silent participant in this trauma that has happened to you. So there's a lot more, the guilt and self-blame that I talked about. Apologies, my 7-year-old just woke up and is randomly screaming in the background. The guilt and shame component of vicarious trauma, multiply that 100 times when it's a family caregiver. So what that does is then your burnout and cynicism and self-blame is so high that it's crippling sometimes. I see a lot of parents particularly who just see, if they're trying to be the caregiver for their children, it's very hard to see your child suffer in the way and you feel helpless and you're providing the support. So it is different. I would say the emotional component of that looks different. This is why caregivers who are supporting family members with trauma absolutely need to get their own care. Right? Therapy is not just for trauma survivors, it's actually for all of us. I can tell you, without my therapist, I don't think I could do this work at all.
In fact, when you were talking about the cynicism, something even I have, I'm thinking about it since the time you have spoken about it. It seems that it's very easy for us to be so indifferent to our own people, the family. Looks like, kind of soft targets. So we have a question by a user who has raised the hand. Can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Mahima, this is Venkat.
Mm-hmm.
This is about a family, actually very close of a friend of us, and they lost their breadwinner, the main person in the family due to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And they are still in the mourning thing. It is more than 2 months now.
Yeah.
So we try to speak to them, or kind of a therapy or a counseling session to some experts, and we used to talk to them regularly. But
Yep.
they actually, if I'm able to use the right word, they are refusing to come out of it. It is kind of
Yes.
refusing.
Yep.
And we all, and especially in our family, because of the close relationship, we feel that because of that, they are actually getting into some kind of a drama there by themselves, and also their progress and the regular day-to-day life is getting affected.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, in that case, what is the thing we can do as a well-wisher or a caregiver?
Great question. And since we have a minute, I'm going to pull up something which maybe for the rest of the group would be helpful too. So give me 1 second.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So Venkat, the question you were asking, the reason I pulled this up is this is the stages of grief mirrors very closely with a trauma journey for a lot of folks, right? So you're talking about this family that is in the first stages. Do you see the shock and denial? They're there.
Yes.
And when we're trying to help them, mostly we're coming from this acceptance position on this curve. Do you see how many stages
Yeah.
we've skipped, right? It's nothing wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think because it's so hard to see somebody hurting that in our mind, we have to get them to acceptance, because that means that then the curve can go up, right? They're going to bounce back. They can be, this is all the stages of resilience, the acceptance, the enthusiasm, the commitment. But if you truly recognize that these are stages, it's not linear, right? It's not going like, okay, today shock and then denial and anger. They could be flip-flopping on this curve, but it gives you a chance to really understand when you're dealing with somebody or a family that is in the shock, denial, and anger, you're not going to get far. They have to be in that stage for as long as it takes for them to be there, but they are going to move out of that stage. And when you get, when you see them moving more towards the depressive end of things, that's actually when the reality is starting to set in more and more. Then you have a better chance at moving them forward.
Actually speaking, to my knowledge, they are in the bargaining stage.
So it's like, if only I had done this, that person would not have died. That kind of thinking.
Yes.
I see. Okay, which still tells you something, right? Like you need these stages to play themselves out, and no matter what there isn't the right thing to say to move them out of this.
Okay, and one more thing is easily able to understand, seeing this entire journey, why the caregiver is getting into a vicarious trauma, because he is also passing through all this entire curve.
Exactly.
The entire presentation is in the single slide. Thank you.
It's very true, because see, this is the thing, right? As a caregiver, you are often in the commitment stage. So telling somebody who's in anger, it's the farthest apart.
Yes.
All right. I think there was another question.
There's a question in the chat. It is very, very important and interesting. If Smita is missed,
Smita, you're on mute, Smita.
Yeah, okay. All right. So yeah, there are many questions in the chat. We have a few questions. So probably we will take about 5 more minutes, Mahima.
That's fine.
Before we go on to the person who has raised their hand, would like to take this question.
I have a question. How vicarious trauma would play out in an intimate relationship where one of the partner has experienced past sexual assault, and how could they deal with it as a unit?
Yeah, great question. So this happens a lot, right? Actually, what I find more and more with a lot of couples is there isn't actually even transparency about what has happened. And a lot of times if these are experiences from childhood that one partner is bringing into the relationship, their repressed memories, the memories aren't always like clear what happened. There's a vague sense of what happened. And then there are cases where it's really clear, this happened to me and I can never trust another human, but we are together and we're going to have to somehow make this work. The thing that I find the most helpful is a lot of times the trauma survivor may be doing their own work in their own psychotherapy. I actually think in addition to that, investing the same amount of energy and concern to getting some help as a couple is really, really important, right? So the reason for that is, yes, you are a caregiver to that person, to your spouse, to your partner. The reality is you're also in a partnership. So it's a very different relationship. So who's taking care of you emotionally? Most of the time we look to our partners to do that, right? So because there's a trauma history, it becomes sort of a one-sided, lopsided relationship, which means even the best of caregivers, the potential for resentment is really high because you're constantly putting your own needs on hold. And it's not selfish to ask for space to have some equity in that relationship. And if you can't do that on your own through setting it up in that way and impressing upon the partner, I actually think getting outside help is a really great idea. I find that even more than couples therapists for trauma relationships, conflict resolution folks are the best help because they have a really clear paradigm of how do you engage in an argument, what are the limits of that, so essentially you can't just put your life on hold in order to help, because that's not going to work for either one of you, right? Same thing as wearing the oxygen mask.
Continues to the question, when you are in an intimate relationship, one of the partner having experienced sexual assault at a very young age, how are you saying still they can stay as a unit?
Great question. And here's the thing, right? I think as the partner who has not experienced the trauma, it's really, really important to communicate that you're sturdy enough to take it, right? The trauma survivor naturally wants to be protective, right? It's not always the case, but when that is the case, I think as the partner who's supporting that person, it's also your responsibility to really communicate sturdiness. And what I mean by sturdiness is that you're not, you can be bumped up against. You're not going to fall apart. It's going to be very hard, but your feelings don't need as much caretaking right now. I would make those things really explicit and clear. And a lot of times we're hesitant to talk about this, right? Like we just hope it'll work itself out, or because I love you, that should be enough. And that's not enough. I would argue that's not enough. It's actually in how we communicate that love, goes back to the boundary setting. Boundary setting is an expression of love, right? If your child is eating 15 bars of Cadbury's, are you going to let them? No, hopefully not, right? At some point, you're going to say no. That's love. That is actually an expression of love. So really coming to some understanding together about what is an expression of love. What does that look like in our relationship? And that looks different for each family member, looks different in each relationship. But I actually think having some language for that is the first step.
Thank you, Mom. That really helps. Thank you.
We have another question, Mahima. So it goes as, how does coping work in a setting when a child grows up in a domestic abuse household? And what tends to happen in this setting is the child takes the place of taking care. So she wants to know how the coping works in this setting, and she's also called this parentification.
Yes. Very true, right? You see this a lot where children start to step in for the parent who's being abused. I would say in a lot of these family systems, that child's acts are not usually acknowledged, right? So if the abusive, they're probably not going to get acknowledgement from the abusive parent, but who they're standing in to protect, right? If that parent is actually able to say, I see what you're doing, I need that, right? I need that protection from you, or you're stepping in for me, which is the parentification. Like you're taking on the parenting role, and I'm not able to. I actually think the acknowledgement of that goes a long way. Goes actually a long way, because the child, a lot of times when I see survivors of domestic violence as children, even though they may not be the recipient of it, I hear this over and over again. My dad or my mom knew what I was doing for them, and they never addressed it. It was as if it didn't matter. It was as if I didn't bring value to that. It's that acknowledgement actually goes a really long way, right? And hopefully, I know circumstances are very different. That parentified role is really hard to sustain over time. It works in the short term, and maybe the parent needs that protection, but that role doesn't actually sustain the child. And so anything you can do to help them realize that that's what they're doing, instill some courage in them that, you know, even though I need your protection, I need you to step up in this way, I'm also capable of doing some of these things, right? Like just having some language, having those conversations is really important. I think there might be...
Yeah, there are...
One question. This is regarding the newsletter. I have seen the newsletter which you have given for the vicarious trauma. When you group it into three broad categories, the avoidance, and you also say it has got the symptoms kind of a PTSD and as a regular first-hand trauma. So how can a vicarious trauma, actually the symptom of avoidance, can we actually see from the either happens to us as a caregiver or the other person who is actually providing support? Avoidance, will it still be seen or can be seen as a symptom?
I think so. I can tell you my own experience of vicarious trauma meant that not all the time, but I was fantasizing about how am I going to get out of here? When am I leaving? Right? And it's not like it's not a pleasant feeling for if you're a caregiver, because you're not trying to escape the person. And when you start feeling that way, that's a sign. And it's not that you're going to feel that way all the time either, right? It's not, you don't feel that all the time, but there are these moments when you start feeling that. And I use avoidance as a way, it's a signal. It's a signal for your own overload.
Okay, thank you.
Mahima, we have a question here. How can the caregiver minimize guilt feeling when not being able to help a totally uncooperative, traumatic person?
Great. I want to say something, and this is also, it's unfortunate, it's at the tail end of our session. I think a lot of times you have trauma-based symptoms. Also, there are other emotional complications that people experience, right? That it is trauma related, but not all of the trauma symptoms in terms of the emotionality and the intensity, the anger, the rage. It is stemming from the trauma, but it's not all trauma. And I think a lot of times when the questions that come up around, you know, I'm trying to be as helpful as possible, but the person isn't responding, that is because that person is still seeing you somehow as a perpetrator of trauma. Even though you're not involved in it, you're not, you know, you're doing the opposite. I think delinking that is important, understanding this. So for example, rage and anger, if it's too much, and it's actually, I mean, this person used the word uncooperative, but I'm imagining that there is an anger version to that uncooperative behavior, right? I actually think it's helpful to kind of set some limit around that. Fully acknowledging this happened to you, I may be implicated in it, but if we are to engage and actually make progress, the way these behaviors has to look a little different, right? That is a boundary, and that's a limit setting. So just letting somebody dump feelings on you without any understanding of why they're doing that, what the limits are of that, not helpful. It's actually not good for that person. So your limit setting may have to look a little different. Yes, are you going to feel guilty? Absolutely. this is why actually reaching out and getting support is also important, right? So if you have another mind to think through the strategy around this, how you're going to set that limit, it can look a little different. But there's no magic bullet, unfortunately.
Yeah, compassion is not about just absorbing everything, right?
Exactly.
So we have this question. Before we ask Dil to unmute the mic, I'm just going to take one question with a follow-up question as well. What is it going to be like if a child grows into adulthood with the same situation? In the sense, in an abusive household, what happens to the child when he or she takes the place of taking care? And how does coping work in that setting?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a challenging question to answer, only because I think there is no one uniform way that children grow up in those settings, right? Because the resources, I have a great example. There's a child I used to work with who grew up with a lot horrific physical abuse and domestic violence, but had a neighbor who was a very protective factor in that child's life. That trajectory looks very different if you don't have any protective factors at all. So it's hard to predict this is what that person's going to turn out to be. But in general, children who grow up in abusive, particularly domestic violence, physical abuse, I'm not talking about sexual abuse because that's a little bit different. There's a emotional attunement that they also have, right? Because their whole life, they've actually been hypervigilant. They know how to read the signs. They know how to read the cues. They also tend to actually go into helping professions, whether we like it or not, because it's like unfortunate learning ground, but you have the best training in a way to understand emotions and what to do with them. So it's not really an answer. I just feel like it's a little bit hard to answer because each circumstance is going to look different. What the surviving parents' capacity, that matters a lot.
So I think either Dr. Mahima, you mentioned it, or I heard it somewhere else, that the beneficial childhood experience questionnaire is actually a good thing for people to do. On the call, you should just look it up on the internet, just do it. You will realize how much of support you had in the childhood, right? And that's very much part of your recognition of the support that you had for your own resilience.
Right.
Can we have Dil to unmute the mics and ask the question?
This is about your previous question and answer about the uncooperative trauma. The caregiver's life becomes even more difficult if the traumatized person is not taking any steps to go towards positivity, whether seeking professional help or whatever it might be. The caregiver doesn't seem to be walking away. What choice do the caregiver have? Then the caregivers has to manage their own emotions, disappointment, anger, and so on. Could you speak a little about that one?
I think one helpful thing I've seen in that kind of dynamic, right? Because it's a cycle, it's a loop. You're just stuck in that loop. The person who needs the help is not going to get the help, and you somehow have to make it all better, is how you're feeling. I find that caregivers actually expressing that they also have an emotional life is really important, because for a lot of times what happens with trauma survivors is they become trauma-centric and they become focused on themselves, right? Not that they don't care about others or anything. Like, this is not to pathologize anyone who's a trauma survivor. It is just really hard to understand that the same range of emotions that you're feeling, your caregiver is also feeling. Other family members are also feeling. The complicated part about this is I kind of touched on this before. If you are a caregiver and you're somehow implicated in the trauma, right? You knew something was happening to this person, you didn't step in as the parent. That in those dynamics, there's actually also a lot of anger at the caregiver. It's not just at the thing that happened, right? Those cases are a little different from if you're not, if something happened to a family member and you're not implicated directly in it. Because I think if you're implicated, if you have not acknowledged it, you're not going to get out of this loop. And a lot of times I think caregivers feel like it wasn't my fault. I didn't know what to do. But there has to be actually some validation of your role, some acknowledgement. That is a starting point. You can start to but if you're sitting in denial and avoidance of your role in it, I see it like a really hard road to climb. And when you're not implicated, I actually think it gives you a lot more freedom and some power to state that, right? That happened to you. I wasn't, it's not under my watch, but now I'm here. This is, I think a lot of partners who are in relationships with trauma survivors have that added advantage of actually saying, I am not your dad. I am not your mom. I'm not that person. We have an opportunity to do something different here, which family caregivers, I think it's different, right? Depending on how you've played a part in it.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of the question and answer. We have exhausted the chat box. If there's any other questions, this is a good time for you to unmute your mic and ask it directly to Mahima. Thank you, Mahima, for overstaying, and we're very mindful about your commitment. So I think, can we bring the session to a close?
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for being here and your active participation. And absolutely. I always feel like I learn a lot every time I do one of these things, right? Because I think what makes it rich is our different perspectives, our different life experience. So thank you for sharing and coming into this space with that intention today.
Absolutely.
Dr.
Thank
Mahima,
you so much.
Thank you everyone for sharing.
Thank you everybody for sharing. Thank you, Mahima, for this very, very insightful session. I think all of us have had a lot of personal and professional takeaways. So thank you for being with us. Thank you everybody for sharing and asking questions. Please stay updated about upcoming webinars in our social media handles. There's also a Google form link somewhere in the chat. If you wish to, you could kind of put in your details so that we can reach out to you as and when things come up. So thank you so much, Mahima. Have a great day.
All right. Have a good weekend.
Happy weekend, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.